Chapter 7 Willie and his Crew. I awoke next morning just before dawn, feeling nearly my old self. My head was tender, but that ghastly ache had practically disappeared. Naturally, the first thing I did was to go on deck, and found that it was a beautiful morning. There was no wind, but some small clouds to port on the horizon gave promise of wind later. My tummy was yelling for food, so I went below and heated up a tin of herrings, which I ate with water biscuits. Still a bit peckish, I had a tin of peaches, several cups of coffee, and felt a man again. There were many things I had to do. First, I must repair Buller's harness, then get ready for the wind, which I hoped would come. After that, I must try to estimate where I might be, decide where I'd better head for, check over the gear, and the chores that are always needing doing. The harness did not take long, and I had barely finished it when the breeze came. I had not had time to make any calculations, but it seemed to me that the only thing to do was to keep on heading east. I set the mainsail, but had to rest several times. I found that most annoyingly, any sustained effort made me tremble for 5 or 10 minutes. However, it was done at last, and I duly headed east again. I kept thinking how lucky it was that there had been none of those violent squalls whilst I had been out. I was pretty sure that there had been none, because if there had, I was sure that the jib and the mizzen would have been ripped, and there must have been other damage. As it was, everything appeared to be ship-shape. What Uhuru had been doing all on her own for that time, I had no means of telling. She might have been merrily sailing north, south, east, or west, for all I knew, sailing in circles, or merely drifting. I felt so angry that what must have been due to my own carelessness had happened. There I was, bang on course, with not far to go, and now I was goodness knows where again. I went below and started up the small engine for charging up the batteries, then returned to the helm and settled down for a long spell of sailing. I found I was making 3 knots, and started to make some calculations as to where I might possibly be, but found that it required quite a large effort to concentrate, and gave it up. As I had told myself so many times before, if I sailed east, I was bound to land up somewhere. The only course left to me was to do just that, and hope for the best. Looking over the side, I found that we were being escorted by about half a dozen fish. They had the appearance of mackerel, and were about 2 feet long. A really nice, fresh fish to eat was just what I wanted. I almost drooled at the thought. A hand line seemed indicated. I tried them with everything I could think of, but nothing seemed to interest them. It was maddening. There they were, a mere 3 or 4 feet away, and, so to speak, unenticable. I had not had any luck with the fish spear on the shark, but it seemed to be spear or nothing. I allowed for the refraction and plunged in after the middle one. I missed, and they scattered for a moment, then reformed. I thought to hell with refraction, and stabbed down into the middle of the shoal, and got one fair and square. Fish have surprising strength. It gave a sort of flip, and yanked the spear out of my hand. I quickly grabbed the line, and yanking in my turn, brought him safely aboard. As before, the remainder had scattered, but again obligingly reformed ranks. 3 or 4 more stabs, and I bagged another, which was a good thing, for on turning round, I found Buller happily chewing the first one. My blood was now up, and I quickly got the fish off the spear, and was determined to get a third. But alas, they had at last learned they were in dangerous waters, and had wisely vanished. Still, I was pretty bucked with 2. Although I had so recently fed, I couldn't wait to eat it. It was the work of a few minutes to fillet it, and then, oh, the delicious smell of frying fish. I decided to make a real feast of this, and pulled it out of the pan, smothered it in flour, and crushing up some biscuits, mixed them up in the flour. Fish fried in bread crumbs. The result wasn't 100%. Nearly all the crumbs floated off, and so did most of the flour. I didn't really care. The fish was the main thing. I must have eaten about half a pound when I had to rush on deck to be violently sick. For the next half hour I did not have much interest in anything, but just hung over the rail and had a very good view of the sea. I naturally ascribed this to the fish, and was convinced that it was poisonous. I worried about Buller, but his share did not seem to upset him at all. Still, it was better to be on the safe side, and I threw the remains overboard. In all probability, it was not poisonous at all, because several times during the next week I was sick without any obvious cause, always after a meal. It may have been the result of concussion. The wind freshened a bit, and I was able to make 4 knots. This was a very comfortable speed, at which Uhuru did not heel over very much, and it was much more comfortable sitting in the cockpit. As soon as we made more, I generally had to bolster myself up with a pillow if I didn't want to sit on a slant. I amused myself by mentally designing a cockpit set in gimbals, so that one could sit in a permanently upright position. This would have saved a lot of fatigue, and also preserved the pants. Nowadays, I don't notice any inconvenience when steering, no matter how much she is heeled over. But in those days, I suppose, I was using a lot of muscles that were normally little used. Also, I was unused to sitting for such long hours, and sometimes I used to get such a backache that I would go and lie flat on my back on deck. A quarter of an hour of this generally put me right again. I once added up all the things one should be if one was to be a really happy and competent yachtsman. I cannot remember all the things I listed, but they included being an engineer, or at least an expert on internal combustion engines, a navigator, a cook, a sailmaker, a carpenter, a trapeze artist, a weather expert, an astronomer, a fisherman, a mathematician, a doctor of minor complaints, aches and injuries, a signaller, a diplomat of the highest degree, useful when dealing with pilfly little officials, a linguist, an electrician, and the knowledge of a minor tinsmith and blacksmith is always useful. Some friends of mine would also add a smuggler to the list. Above all, one must be fit and a reasonably strong man. I know Anne Davidson would not agree to the latter, but then she only made one voyage, and if I interpret her feelings correctly, once was enough for her. I am not detracting 1 degree from her magnificent performance, but the constant strain on a woman is naturally more than that on a man. I have been asked occasionally by fellows who are contemplating joining our fraternity whether I would recommend a companion on their first venture, and I always answer yes, most definitely. There is always the danger of injury, as I know to my cost, but apart from that, there will be someone to share that terrible anxiety. If we are honest, we must admit assails the first voyager. If when you have gained the necessary experience, you feel competent to go it alone, then again it depends on temperament. There are few things worse than 2 or 3 people of incompatible temperament being sealed up together for weeks or months at a time. The other side of that picture is loneliness. I have experienced both, and can only say that nothing is finer than having a sterling companion, such as I had in John, of whom more anon, and nothing worse than a married couple who crewed for me from New Zealand to Australia, and who quarreled the whole trip. But I wander, a bad habit of mine. There seems to be nothing of note in my log during the next 2 days. I sailed during the day, and hove to at night, averaging 4 knots when sailing. My head, though jolly tender to the touch, still seemed to be all right, and ceased to bother me. I regained my strength surprisingly quickly. These were ideal days for sailing, and now that I had given up worrying about where I was, I enjoyed them to the full. We seemed to have got out of the flying fish department. At least, none came aboard. Actually, I have never since experienced such a glut of flying fish as I did that first trip, and have often gone weeks in tropical waters without even one coming aboard. Also, there seemed to be no other fish around. I always had a line out, both day and night, but had no luck. I twice sighted whales, but they were away off on both occasions, and once there was quite a disturbance about half a mile astern, but I was unable to make out what it was. Something was threshing about. It looked as if there might be a couple of whales fighting, but whatever it was certainly 2 pretty hefty denizens of the deep, either making love or having a rough house. I could hear the splashings quite distinctly, and the rumpus must have lasted half a minute before it or they sank below the surface. A rather peculiar thing happened that same evening, or rather night. I was up forward doing something or other, and happened to glance astern. There, sitting in the cockpit, was a naked man. For a moment or two I stood there flabbergasted. It was an absolute impossibility. I took a couple of steps towards him and shouted, "What the hell?" and immediately the illusion vanished. There was no one there. I thought that I must be going mad. I went below and thoroughly searched everywhere, but naturally drew a blank. I knew that it was impossible for anyone to have stowed away and remained hidden all that time, and at the same time I had so distinctly seen someone. I went forward again and took up the same position I was in when I saw him, and damn it, there he was again. It was a 3/4 moon, and I could see the wake through him. I again started to move, and instantly the illusion, for that is what it must have been, disappeared. It was obviously a trick of light, but although I tried again several times to recreate the illusion, I was unsuccessful. I must have struck just the right position, coupled with the angle of sail, plus the right arrangement of moonlight, swell, and shadows. That is, of course, the only and rational explanation, but it seemed rather uncanny at the time, and I admit I felt a certain reluctance in settling down in the cockpit. I kept telling myself not to be a damn fool, that Buller would most certainly bark at any ghost or other nocturnal intruder, but the feeling persisted. I have an open mind regarding ghosts and things that go bump in the night. So many apparently sane people believe in them. Conan Doyle was an ardent believer, but he believed in fairies as an encore, and he once showed me some pictures he had taken which certainly appeared to be genuine snaps of ghostly beings. But then I am no expert on faked pictures. I am a friend of Jasper Maskelyne, the famous illusionist who now lives in Kenya, and he told me that he would guarantee to reproduce any phenomenon that the spiritualists claimed were genuine. So many believe, so many don't, and I have yet to be convinced. Nevertheless, it was a bit creepy, although, as I said, I knew in my heart it was merely a trick of the lights. I slept as soundly as ever. Next morning the wind was a bit fresher, and I made a good 5 knots, which I kept up till about 4 in the afternoon, when the wind dropped to a light breeze. I liked these evenings when it was cool, with a long steady swell. The sunsets were particularly beautiful, and I often noticed the greenish flash just before the sun sank below the horizon. The moon was coming into full. It was just about over the 3/4, and the evenings and nights were a delight. Orion's belt and the evening star were particularly brilliant, and so were the pointers. I wished I knew more about the stars so that I could identify them. However, I determined to make up for that and learn astral navigation. It was said to be a lot easier. I had not listened to my wireless for some days, but when that evening I switched on, all I could get was ghastly Indian music, or a lot of talk in foreign languages, and strangely enough, Johannesburg, but there was too much static in it to make it enjoyable. It was a good and expensive wireless, and I should have been able to raise several stations, so decided to check it over, and I found that the amplifier was badly connected. Once this was rectified, I had no further trouble, and could get the BBC easily. I could also get the Kenya station, but that was always little boys with guitars and infantile, uneducated voices. Rock and roll isn't bad if played well. It's the singers who ruin it, at least to my ears. All that day I had kept up a good speed, at least good for me, and as usual hove to in the evening. I had resigned myself to the fact that I had missed the islands, and spent a lot of time pondering where I should land up. I was thankful that I had taken on such a large cargo of stores. Whatever happened, I could hardly help making some sort of landfall during the course of a year, and now I came to think about it, perhaps this was more fun. I remembered how years ago in England, mystery tours used to be popular. You got on a sherry, and for the next week you were taken to all sorts of places. I was rather in the same street. I had got on a boat, and certainly did not know where I was going. As for Buller, he didn't care a hoot, as long as he was with me. It blew quite hard during the night, which was unusual, but eased off towards dawn, and by the time I got on deck, there was a stiff breeze, but no more. It was perfect sailing weather, and I hurriedly had breakfast, and then set the sails, jib, main, and mizzen as usual. I always left the mizzen during the night. It kept her head on, but reefed it down a little. I was getting quite handy with the sails, and wished I knew some sea shanties to bawl out when I was hoisting them. However, I was fairly good at making up my own, not perhaps drawing-room ones, but satisfactory. Having set the sails, I generally did a captain's round, examining everything for wear, plunging the hand-bilge pump up and down a few times, though there was seldom anything to pump out, and mostly ended up by shining the main mast to have a look round generally. I did so this day, and nearly fell into the sea. There, some miles ahead, was a boat. I could hardly believe my eyes. I shut them, counted 10, and opened them again. It was no hallucination. There, right in front of me, was a boat. I clung to the mast and gaped. It seemed unbelievable. True, it didn't seem much of a boat. It looked like a small yawl, or rather as if it had been a small yawl, for it had lost its mast, and was jury-rigged, if you could call it rigged. For the scrap of sail they had looked about the size of a pocket handkerchief from where I was. I could see men aboard waving shirts or some sort of materials. They need not have been anxious. Nothing on earth would have stopped me from speaking to them. In fact, of the two, it was probably I who was the most anxious. I don't know how long I hung up there, I believe I had some sort of idea that if I took my eyes off them, they would vanish. Buller's barking got me out of my trance. Now, if ever was the time for the engine to prove itself, I think that I got the sails down in record time, despite the fact that I kept on looking towards the boat. It occurred to me that I had not acknowledged their frantic signals, and in fact I had veered off quite a bit, and they might be thinking that I had not seen them. I dived below and came up with a string of signal flags, which I ran up. That, at any rate, would relieve their minds. I took a deep breath and switched on the engine. She started up as sweetly as a Rolls-Royce, and I started to steer straight for them. Sitting in the cockpit, all excited, it came to me that the flags were quite unnecessary. They must have seen me lowering the sails. However, I thought that the brave display added tone to the rescue. Already I visualized the headlines in the press. Captain Ricky, master of the Ch7-8, intrepid sailor, effects magnificent rescue at sea, but for his courage and masterly handling of his boat, said one of the rescued crew when interviewed. Not a soul would have been saved. Few men could have handled his boat with such skill and daring, Captain Ricky agreed. Meanwhile, I was rapidly drawing up to them, and by now could hear them shouting. I could distinctly make out 4 men. I was a bit dubious about how to approach. If the truth were told, I certainly did not want to come right alongside and have the 2 boats grinding together in the swell. There were some rope fenders in the sail locker, and I got all these out and hung them all along the port side. I thought of sailing in as near as possible, and then telling them to swim for it, but discarded that idea on account of possible sharks. I thought of letting the dinghy drift down on them, or better still, I could heave to and let them come to me in their own dinghy. But first of all I decided to cruise round them and see if they had any bright suggestions. I closed them about half a cable's length to windward, and they were all shouting and laughing and waving hats. I had set the throttle full ahead, and was doing a good 8 knots, and before I knew it, I had swept past them. I eased off the engine until I just about had way on her, and then circled back. She certainly seemed to be in a bad way, with mast and rigging gone, and there seemed to be an oar affair, with a piece of board on the end, which was acting as a rudder. The sail turned out to be pieces of blankets, and of all things, embroidered pillowcases. She seemed to be making no headway at all, but merely drifting to lee. I made my second approach as slowly as I dared, and managed to pass this time within about 4 or 5 feet. My bows had hardly come level with her stern, when 2 of the men took a flying leap and landed aboard. They rushed up to me, hugged me, shook my hand, all the while talking at the top of their voices. I could make little of what they said. It seemed to be a mixture of French, English of a sort, and some unknown lingo. By the time I had battled myself free, we had again drawn ahead, leaving the other 2 still aboard. A bottle of rum was conveniently in the cockpit, and I handed it to them. I don't know how much was in when they started, but there was none when they had finished. I there and then decided to keep a close watch on the rest. If their pals had the same capacity, we should quickly develop into a dry ship. Meanwhile, there were the two chaps to get aboard. As I circled round again, I asked them where they were from, and was absolutely delighted when they said the Seychelles Islands. By heck, I was going to make it after all. I almost, but not quite, got out another bottle of rum on the strength of it. I asked them how far off we were, and they answered, "Far, far." This wasn't so good, but why worry? I now had 4 pilots aboard, or I should have in a few minutes. My worries were over. There were so many questions I wanted to ask, but they were alternately gabbing so much, and shaking each other's hands, and mine, too, when they got the chance, that I gave it up, and decided to wait till I had got the others off, especially as one of the men said that Willie, who was still on the other boat, spoke good English. I completed the circle and again brought up alongside within jumping distance. One man immediately leapt across, but the other Willie, as it turned out, shouted, "Please throw rope." I am not the sort of man who carries length of rope on his person, and by the time I had shouted, "What the hell for?" and received the reply, "Make a tow," we had again slipped past. My third passenger immediately subjected me to the handshaking and hugging that the other two had indulged in, as well as hugging the others. There was more back-slapping all round. I completed a third round, but this time cut the engine and laid off about 40 or 50 yards away. I yelled out to Willie that I had no tow rope, only a 1-inch manila, which I was positive would not hold a tow. There ensued a long and too incomprehensible conversation between the 4 of them. Arms waved, shoulders shrugged. Practically every emotion was registered. It sounded like a conversation between Northern and Southern Irish across the border. I could not get a word in edgeways. Every time I tried to speak, one of the 3 I had aboard would say, "Yes, yes, soon, all is well," or something equally annoying. The upshot was that they asked to see the rope I had. When I showed it to them, they fell upon it with delighted cries, hauled it up on deck, and showed it to Willie, who by now I had gathered was the captain. Another long argument ensued, at the end of which Willie shouted, "Yes, that will make very good rope, Captain. We make very good tow rope from that captain." I think it was being addressed as captain for the first time in my nautical career that made me offer no protest when the 3 started to measure and cut the cable into 3 lengths, which they started to plait in a very cunning manner. I must say that they knew how to plait ropes. When it was finished, which it was in a remarkably short time, there was a good sturdy-looking rope, albeit somewhat short, I thought, for the job. While all this was going on, we had drifted a bit too close together for my liking, and I started up the engine again, and sheered off a bit. It seemed to me that, far from me making a gallant rescue, the matter had been taken out of my hands, and I was fast becoming a mere spectator, one to be ordered about, whilst admitting to myself these chaps no doubt knew more about seamanship and sailing boats generally. I felt that was no reason to boss me about on my own boat. Damn it, I was captain, with a hell of a large capital C. I decided that the time had come to assert myself, and the opportunity came at once. One of them hoiked and spat on the deck. I leapt out of the cockpit and yelled at him, "What the hell do you think you're doing, spitting on deck? Wipe it up." He gaped at me. "Go on," I said, pointing to the splash. "Wipe it up, or I'll bloody well use you to wipe the deck clean." "Yes, Captain, yes, sir," he said, and taking off a filthy-looking scarf, he bent down and wiped it up. It was a petty thing to do, really, but with all the excitement there had been, I suppose that none of us was in a normal state of mind. At any rate, they seemed to me to be eyeing me with a new respect after this episode, and henceforth asked permission to do this and that. Once the tow rope had been completed, another long argument ensued, but this time I joined in. I asked Willie how far the islands were, and as I was not prepared to tow that hulk for days on end, he replied that they were near, quite near, not very far at all, Captain. In fact, by the time he'd finished explaining how near they were, I was surprised that we were not practically aground on one. My suggestion that they abandon their boat was turned down flat, and I couldn't really blame them. Eventually, it was arranged that 2 of them should stay with me, and the other 2 return aboard the boat. Apparently, it needed pumping quite frequently, and also it would be easier to tow if someone was steering it. Willie elected to remain in his own boat, together with his engineer. Why the engineer stayed, I don't know, as their engine was out of commission, and when I examined this later, I was surprised that it had ever functioned at all. It must have been about 30 years old, and was simply worn out. I may as well tell their story here. They were, it appeared, shark fishermen. 4 nights before they had been fishing, and had anchored down in the shallow waters of the plateau which surrounds the islands, for some 100 or so miles in all directions. During the night, one of the usual squalls had descended upon them, but they had not taken much notice of this until suddenly they discovered that their anchor had come adrift. It was not apparently a really heavy squall, and they decided to set the sails and head back home. After they had been sailing for an hour or so, the violence of the wind and sea increased, and a real storm developed. A gust of unusual violence laid the boat practically flat on the sea, and the mast went with a terrific crack. The mast and rigging were held by stays and bashed about, finally smashing the rudder. After much trouble, they managed to cut the wreckage adrift, and were then of course adrift themselves, being rudderless and the engine being out of commission. It had failed a couple of days earlier, and they had, not surprisingly, been unable to repair it. For 2 days and nights they had experienced hell, being rolled and blown all over the place. But on the 3rd day the storm had blown itself out, and since then they had just drifted around. The scrap of sail and makeshift rudder being practically useless, they had all given themselves up for lost, and one and all agreed that I had been sent direct by Providence to rescue them. Who knows? They might have been right. After quite a lot of messing about, we eventually got the tow rope attached to both boats, and were ready to set off for the islands. Willie rather annoyed me. He kept shouting instructions regarding what we were to do, and he reached my limit when he shouted, "Right, start the engine." I wasn't going to have that. I turned to the 2 new members of my crew and said we would either sail or I would abandon their boat, and despite all the arguments, which included that it would be impossible to tow under sail, the rope would most certainly snap, which it did many times. The waves would cause the tow to give terrific jerks on the rope, and undoubtedly pull out the bollards. That sailing would take too long, and so on. Sails it was. Oh, what a treat to have someone else to do all the work, whilst I merrily sat at the wheel. In no time at all they had the sails up, and astounded me by getting another jib out of the locker and setting that also. Stupidly, I had never realized that one could set 2 jibs. The time I could have saved if I had known this. The sails set, I called one of the chaps, whose name I discovered was Tutu, and asked him what the course was. He yelled out to Willie for instructions. The usual long argument transpired, at the end of which he said, "Monsieur, we do not know where we are, for never before have we been out of sight of the islands." I gaped at him. "We are quite content, you understand, for you to have charge of everything that is necessary." It was said in very broken English, but that was the gist of it. I nearly went mad. That made 5 of us who did not know where we were. What a hell of a mess! The most intelligent chap seemed to be the one named Willie, and I thought that it would be better for all concerned if he came aboard my boat, and let one of the others go to his. After the inevitable argument this was done, though not without trouble, as we had to lower the sails to get way off, and maneuver close enough to effect the transfer. However, it was accomplished in the end. Willie was appalled to learn that I knew no more than he did where we were. All his talk about being so near was a lot of nonsense. He had merely said that to make sure I did not take them off and abandon his boat. I questioned him closely about where they had been anchored, what direction the wind came from, how far he estimated they had drifted during the storm, and had he any idea in which direction the islands lay. He said he had, and pointed southwest. This did not seem quite right to me, because I was of the opinion that the wind and storm would surely have blown in the same direction as the monsoon. But he was adamant that the wind had come from the southwest. I took him down to study the chart, but it did not seem to convey much to him. In fact, I believed it was the first time he had ever seen a chart. I started to read out the names of the various islands, and at the mention of each one he said, "Yes, yes." I asked which island he had been anchored off, and at long last got the information. It was St. Therese, and on the east of the group. If he was correct in his estimation of the direction of the storm, then we should certainly head southwest. Well, it was as good a direction as any other, so I headed her on that course. We started to tow, and we seemed to crawl along. I was unable to ascertain what we were doing, as the tow rope kept dipping into the sea, and the log line would quickly have got tangled up in it. The rope jerked, and then slacked off, and I began to wonder whether the bollards would stand up to the strain. We had attached the tow rope to the two smallish bollards aft, and obviously they had not been meant to stand up to this sort of treatment. However, there was nothing else to which I could attach it, and, as Willie said 20 times a day, we were all in the hands of the saints. The tow veered alarmingly from side to side, nearly all the time, but after some while those aboard her seemed to get the hang of it, and with the aid of their makeshift rudder eventually managed to keep her roughly in line astern. However, I was extremely doubtful whether I, or rather we, would ever be able to hang on sufficiently long to get her to port. We could but try. At about 6 o'clock that evening, the tow rope broke for the first time. It had apparently been chafed right through where it came over the bows of the tow. This was not serious, and in fact we had expected something like this to happen, but it wasted a lot of time. I persuaded them to take down their silly sail and use the pillowcases to muffle the rope and thereby ease the chafing. By the time we got under way again, it was dark, and I thought it was time for food. The two crew were most impressed with my cooking arrangements. They told me that they cooked by a small fire in a bucket like a fair. I thought that a sea rescue like this called for some sort of celebration, and opened a large variety of tins of fish, meat, vegetable tomato soup, fruit, and a tin of cream. As you will no doubt have gathered, I am a fair trencherman myself, but I was and also ran compared to these chaps. Having prepared the meal, I said I would take the helm whilst they ate, and they could relieve me when they had finished. I had, I thought, cooked and opened enough, even more than enough for 3, but when they eventually appeared on deck, they had left me nothing at all. They'd scoffed the lot. I was a bit annoyed at having to start all over again with my culinary efforts, and made do with a tin of steak and kidney pudding for myself. The wind held nice and steady, and we seemed to be making slightly faster progress, and have better control. We agreed to have watches, with 2 always on duty, the odd man relieving 1 every 3 hours, which meant 6 hours on and 3 off. As I was the freshest, I volunteered to stand in with the first watch, which I shared with Willie. It appeared that he was not a captain, but a coxswain, and that he and the rest of the crew worked for an owner on a sort of commission basis, and the amount they earned was dependent upon the weight of sharks they caught. The shark was dried and salted and eventually exported to East Africa and other eastern markets. He said that the average fisherman could earn about £5 a month, but that the catching season only lasted about 5 months, and the rest of the year they had to exist by taking any odd jobs that turned up, which I gathered were few and far between. There was one rather unpleasant thing about these chaps. An aura of fish hung round them, and I had noticed a terrific fishy stench attached to their boat. I may say that despite the fact that they washed fairly frequently and stripped off and soaped all over whenever we got a shower of rain, which we often did, the smell clung to them like a miser to his gold. I naturally didn't like to mention this, but Buller had no such qualms, and sniffed enthusiastically at them. Tutu asked me why Buller kept sniffing at him, and when I said that I thought his clothes might smell of fish a bit, he said that it was possible, but that he hadn't noticed it himself. Apparently, when they had a good catch of shark, and the little ship was loaded with them, they thought nothing of sleeping in their clothes on a heap of shark. That was where all those embroidered pillow slips came in. They always came aboard with a tasteful selection, which changed every few days. The skin of a shark, they explained, was rather rough on the face. They had, they said, about 3 tons of shark aboard, and I suggested that they jettison this, as it would lighten the tow, but they were horrified at the idea. It was, they averred, chucking good money into the sea, and when I remembered how little they earned, I could appreciate their point. Willie was the only one who was a talker. The others who chatted amongst themselves, as often as they were within hailing distance, seldom if ever spoke to me. If I asked a question, I generally got a surprised sort of stare and a shrug of the shoulders, as if to express surprise that anyone could be so ignorant of such everyday affairs. If I started a conversation by asking a question and added, "That is so, isn't it?" I would get, "As Monsieur says," or more generally, "Who knows?" However, Willie made up for any lack of social graces on the part of his companions. He talked incessantly, and would often forego his watch below in order to continue his discourse. During the course of one conversation, he told me that they were all very worried, as the owner, or patron as they called him, made them pay for any damage to boat or gear, and would undoubtedly charge them a crippling amount of money for this unfortunate trip. In fact, they were at their wits' end, as they were already paying for a sail that had been blown to ribbons the last trip. They were of the opinion that he would cut their pay by half for the next couple of years. Perhaps it would have been better, said Willie, if they had all been drowned, and spared the misery of paying off such a colossal debt, contracted by what was, after all, no fault of theirs. It was no good hoping for any mercy, as the patron was known to one and all in the islands as a mean bastard. Now this making them pay business struck me as the quintessence of meanness, and avarice, especially as they said the patron was a very wealthy man. If I am really annoyed, I can be a mean bastard myself, and a very simple solution to their problem stared me in the face. I would get this little boat back to the islands, if it was the last thing I did, and by heck, I would sting this mean so-and-so of a patron for every cent that I could claim for salvage, and I would make a hell of a large claim. I mulled this idea over, and could see no fault with it. I was not up at all in nautical law regarding salvage, but I was pretty sure that I had an indisputable claim. Having rescued these men, I felt a responsibility towards them, although I did not know why I should have. But there it was. I was definitely on their side, and prepared to battle on their behalf. I did not at once advise them of my idea, as I wanted to get to know both of them and their circumstances better, and whether they would be prepared to play along with me. Meanwhile, we were plugging along in what I hoped was the right direction. The weather god evidently looked upon us with a kind eye, and sent constant and favorable winds. Nothing noteworthy happened until the second evening, when Tutu shouted and pointed aft, where a flock of small birds were coming up astern. To my surprise, they immediately settled all over the boat, and seemed to have no fear of us at all. If one of us approached too near, they would sidle away, and it was only Buller who, charging them, made them take wing to another part of the boat. The advent of these birds was hailed with great joy by all the men. They said that the birds were making for the islands, and their presence was a sure sign that we were on course, and had not far to go. They said these birds made a habit of settling on fishing boats when the crew slept, would often perch right on them. Needless to say, the tow rope chose this moment to part, and we all had to start the weary business of mending it. Chapter 8. Landfall. Next morning, I tried out an idea that had occurred to me during the night. Why not jury-rig one of my spare sails on the other boat? True, there was a mere stump of each mast, but the bowsprit was still intact, and I felt sure that something could be rigged, which would, at any rate, help to push her along. I explained my idea to Willie, and he was enthusiastic. He even suggested that we could take out my mizzen and rig that, but I put my foot firmly down on that idea. After breakfast, I put Willie and Tutu aboard their own craft, and they set about dismantling the bowsprit. This proved easy enough, the difficulty being to attach it to the stump. I solved this difficulty in the following manner. The stump was surprisingly thick at the base, and by cutting a groove in the side facing aft, we were able to fit the bowsprit almost in it. I then drilled 3 holes and bolted the 2 together. This gave a mast of sorts about 7 feet high. I did not think it would be strong enough to support cross trees, as it tapered considerably at the top. A block and tackle was therefore tied on at the summit, and there remained the difficulty of spreading the sail. This was solved by affixing a couple of bunk boards at the base of the mast crosswise, giving us a triangle. To our chagrin, it was then discovered that the block had been put on in such a way that had we run up a sail, it would have been pressing against the mast, and we had to shin up and turn it round the other way. We used a jib for a sail, and we all cheered when it was at last run up. The next thing was to improve on the makeshift rudder, and here again bunk boards came in useful. A contraption was eventually evolved similar to the rudder oars one sees on Chinese junks, and this proved eminently satisfactory. I have said I and we, but in actual fact it was the islanders who did all the actual work. I confining myself to shouting out instructions and advice, at which I am pretty good. When all was ready, Willie and Tutu came back aboard, and we once more set off. It was really surprising the difference the scrap of sail and the new rudder made. There were not so many of those terrific jerkings on the rope, and we seemed to be sailing much more smoothly, and also appeared to have added a little to our speed. I had suggested to Willie that the other two chaps should be given a break, and that he and Tutu swapped over, but he pooh-poohed the idea, saying that they were used to long hours, and further had got used to the vagaries of the tow. I did insist, however, that we sent them over some better food, but thought it better not to send over any hard liquor. Actually, I had kept mum about the drink I had aboard, not from being unwilling to share it, but because I thought that if they knew of the store I had, they might get blind drunk. I had good reason to think this, as Willie was always recounting tales of heroic drunks he had ashore, and I gathered that many shark fishers went on monumental drunks whenever they got the chance. Not that I blamed them in the least. Considering the hard lives they lived, they were entitled to all the pleasure they could get. I promised them a week's blissful intoxication if and when we ever reached port. I gathered that they did not get much pleasure out of life. In fact, their greatest pleasure seemed to be derived from the fact that it was generally recognized throughout the islands that shark fishers lead extremely dangerous lives, and were good, tough men in every sense of the word. Girls, I gathered, practically fought for their favors, and a shark man, particularly if he was a coxswain, could take his pick of the many beauties, at least according to Tutu, who told me. Apart from matters connected with their trade, they spoke of little other than women and drink. There were, it appeared, certain exotic creatures who apparently passed from hand to hand, living with whoever happened to be ashore at the time. There were reigning beauties, who were considered tops, and their various charms were discussed with knowledgeable detail. Willie was an exception. He would talk about anything under the sun, whether he had any knowledge of the subject or not. Not that he didn't talk about women, he did, but he was willing to switch from the subject. He was deeply interested in East Africa, as indeed I was to find all the islanders were. Kenya in particular was believed to be a land of milk and honey, where one was almost begged to work for unbelievably high wages. However, the trouble was to get there. How could one save the fare? He told me of families who clubbed together to send a scion to Kenya, on the understanding that he sent home enough money to keep his relatives in moderate comfort. I asked whether this worked, and he said that generally they sent money back for some months, sometimes even a year. But, he added characteristically, what would you? There are women in Kenya, also much English beer, and they want to buy cars and motorbikes, and they send back less and less, with many excuses about high rents and taxes to be paid and doctors' bills. So he shrugged and left it at that. I understood perfectly. Later that same afternoon, Willie told me that a leak on the tow had been discovered and successfully plugged. Also that there was a large shark aboard that they had not had time to salt before the storm hit them, and they proposed to heave it overboard as it was getting a bit high. It must have been damned high for them to have noticed it. I again tried to persuade them to jettison all the shark, as I believed that we should make more speed if their boat rowed lighter, but could not persuade them. My log for the next 2 days says, battling along, rope broke last night on 2 occasions. If it does this at night in a high wind or sea, we may not be able to pick her up. Have used all spare rope on their boat to reinforce it, and crew say they can feel land near. Cannot feel it myself, but have certainly seen plenty of birds and weed. So they are probably right. Cannot believe it, and shall not till I see it. They are all very excited. So am I, but I endeavor to preserve an outward calm, as if it means nothing to me, and is no less than I expected. All of us stayed on watch that night. They were so sure that we should make a landfall at any moment. I asked them which island it was likely to be, and they rattled off a string of names, each one sure that he had the answer. Of one thing they were all sure, it would not be Mahi, but one of the islands either north or east of Mahi, for chaps who had lived and sailed about the islands all their lives. It seemed strange to me that they should be so ignorant of their position. However, there it was. Personally, as long as we managed to make a decent landfall, and I could get shot of this ruddy tow, I would be happy. I planned to send a cable to Jerry, saying how much I had enjoyed the trip, how easy it was, mentioning in passing my epic rescue of a derelict, and all hands, and signing it Captain Ricky. In the event, as I shall relate, Jerry had cabled first. However, we first had to find the island. As soon as there was the slightest suspicion of dawn, I shinnied up the mast, but naturally saw nothing. I had rather hoped to smell land, even if I couldn't see it, but realized that with all that stinking shark about, this was a faint hope. With full light, there was still no land in view. About every 10 minutes, someone would go aloft and eagerly scan the horizon. There were several false alarms, islands that turned out to be nothing more than clouds. I found myself saying, "I won't look again for another hour," but in about a quarter of an hour I would be found shinning up again. In fact, between the three of us, it was seldom that there was not someone aloft. The honor of first sighting land fell to me. For some reason I had previously not thought to take my binoculars up with me, but going below for something or other, I saw them in their clips by the companionway. I slung them round my neck and went on deck, and the mast being unoccupied at the moment, up I went. I couldn't help my face breaking into a terrific grin. There, on the starboard beam, was a small blackish dot. This was no cloud. It was definitely land. Although I was positive I did not want to initiate any more false alarms, I stuck up there with my eyes glued to the glasses for the next few minutes. Willie shouted up, "What you see?" But I shook my head. I let the glasses hang round my neck and fiddled about with the masthead light for quite a while, but eventually could not resist having another look. It was still there. Admittedly, it did not seem to be any larger, but there was now no doubt about it. That dot was land. I gave myself some exquisite pleasure pondering how I should announce the miracle, and eventually decided to be strictly nautical. Taking a deep breath at the top of my lungs, I bellowed, "Land on the starboard beam." The effect was all I could have desired. Willie, who was at the helm, leapt out of the cockpit and dashed for the mast. Tutu had the same idea, and they met with a thud, with the result that they both sat down on the deck. Still being nautical. Hell, I was the captain, wasn't I? I shouted, "Get back to the helm, Willie, and hold your course," as if all our lives depended on it. Willie practically dived back into the cockpit and sat there shouting, "West," over and over again. I know that the reader would undoubtedly at this point have taken a bearing, soundings, consulted the chart, and done all of the correct things. I regret to record that I merely pointed and shouted, "Over there!" Willie could bear it no longer. "Let me see, he kept saying. Very reluctantly I shinnied down and took over the helm and altered course to hit the island bang on the nose. Tutu had shouted the glad news to the tow, and both of the men were staring forward and shouting, as indeed I fear we all were. It was, however, still invisible from the deck. I began to have qualms about shoals and reefs. A nice thing if we were to run aground now. I asked Willie if he knew which island it was, but he shouted down that he would know in a minute. I told him to remain up there and keep a lookout for reefs, although I realized that we were too far off to hit the reef of the island. There might easily be atolls and mushroom and niggerhead corals about. He was nothing loath, and kept saying that yes, he saw it plainly now, without the glasses. Now it was I who got the fidgets, and I insisted on changing places with him. Poor Tutu, who so far had not had a chance, pleaded for a look, and I let him go aloft for a quick shifta. When I again looked through the glasses, it had grown quite a bit larger, but was still too far off to distinguish any landmarks. I again took the helm. I had a vague idea that the captain takes her in, and the mate takes her out, and I wanted everything done decently and in order, and came to a decision. "Take the sails off her," I said. "We'll take her in on the engine." My reasons for this were simple. Firstly, she was so much easier to handle under power, and there might be devilish currents about near the island. And secondly, we should get there a lot quicker. Now that we were about to make our landfall, all my ideas of "it doesn't matter how long it takes" went by the board. I was in a positive fever to get there. It was a matter of minutes to lower the sails and start up the engine. Alas, the old adage, "more haste, less speed," was correct in this instance. I gave her too much power, with the result that we started off with a terrific jerk, and needless to say the toe snapped for the umpteenth time. Then happened an incident that left me speechless. There seemed to be more than the usual arguing and shouting going on, and I asked Willie what was the matter, and why they didn't get on with the job. Beaming, he turned to me and said, "They have agreed that we use the new rope." I said I had no new rope. We would simply have to do with the old one, which, by the way, had grown considerably shorter by now, as we were always tying knots in it. "Not yours, ours," he said, and pointed over to the toe. There, sure enough, was Tutu, coming up on deck, lugging a terrific coil of what appeared to be brand new rope. Good, thick, strong stuff. I nearly went mad. What the hell, I asked. Hadn't they produced this in the first place, and saved us all the bother and delay caused by my short rope? The captain didn't understand. This rope supplied by the patron after many beggings and pleadings had been given to them on the strict understanding that any they used they would have to pay for. Naturally, as I had a rope, it was better to use mine than to use theirs and have to pay for it. What could I say? When I remembered their poverty, I had to admit to myself that I should probably have done the same in their circumstances. However, I mentally added 100 quid onto my claim for salvage. The more I heard about this patron, the less I liked him. To make these poor devils pay for rope used on his boat struck me as about the limit. Now that land was in sight, I was in a fever for everything to be done quickly. It may have been my imagination, but fixing the tow rope seemed to take 5 times as long as usual. Everyone was clumsy with knots, and twice they dropped an end into the water, and it took ages to recover it. Eventually I seized hold of it myself, and lugged a good length aboard, so that it would not be lost overboard again, even if they did drop it. At long last, all was ready, and oh, what a difference it made! That extra length on the tow, and being under power, she did not veer half as much. At least, it did not seem so to me, and it was almost a pleasure to steer. I still could not trail the log, so I do not know what we were making, but it must have been all of 3 knots, and we seemed to be whizzing along. After about half an hour, the island was in plain sight, but it was still impossible to distinguish any features. To quote from the log, "Island now in plain sight, 11:15 a.m. Don't think we'll make it before dark, and shall not risk a night landing. Shall get near enough for comfort, and then heave to till dawn. Crew still doubtful about which island it is, but don't care a damn personally." We sailed on until 6:30, when signs of evening began to appear. We were still a good way off, but I thought that there might be a drift towards the shore, or a strong current in that direction, and could visualize a nasty smash-up on some coral outcrop or reef. I had stopped the engine for half an hour at about 5 o'clock, in an endeavor to ascertain whether we would drift or were drifting, and if so, in what direction. There didn't appear to be any drift. We just seemed to hang about where we were. In any case, we had to risk it, and I did not think that we should drift out of sight during the night. As soon as we had snugged down, a dead calm fell, which was a piece of luck. We got the others aboard, and had a good blow out to celebrate. I have mentioned before how those chaps could eat, but one would almost have to see it to believe it. I remember this meal well. We each had a whole tin of soup first, and each then consumed a tin of salmon and buttered biscuits. It appeared that the chaps on the tow had caught a tunny that day, and 4 of us sat and had an interval whilst Tutu fried it. This tunny must have been all of 10 pounds, but it disappeared like lightning. At this point I fell out, and retired to make cocoa for the meal, and also to fill a thermos. Whilst I was thus engaged, each demolished a tin of bully. Then they shared 2 tins of cheese between them, and a pound of biscuits, topping the lot off with a tin of fruit each. By the time they had demolished the lot, the cocoa was ready, but many were the remarks about how much better a meal like that would have been if there had been beer or wine instead of cocoa. Best of all, said Tutu, his voice heavy with meaning, would be whiskey. They all looked at me expectantly, and from the looks of hope and eagerness that were bestowed upon me, it was evident that they had discovered my case of trading and bribery whiskey. I was almost tempted, and they must have noticed my hesitation, for they all looked at me and reported that whiskey would be ideal to top off the meal. However, better counsel prevailed, and I said, "No, ashore we drink, but not aboard." And I didn't feel at all hypocritical when I later secretly poured myself a generous tot of rum before turning in for the night. We were all up at the first crack of dawn, and there was the island in plain sight, and we had drifted nearer, in fact were within about 4 miles of it. The other two got back onto the tow, and it was a matter of minutes to start up and set off. I went pretty slowly, as I was still scared of hidden reefs or shallows, and when we were about 1.5 miles off, I turned to starboard and began to sail round, looking for a place to land. There did not seem to be a reef at all, and we could see the rollers smashing against what appeared to be rocky cliffs and sending up huge mountains of spray. It was obvious that the port or jetty, or whatever it turned out to be, must be on the lee of the island. The island itself was not very high. It appeared to be about 300 feet at its highest point, and was mostly bare rock, with very little soil or vegetation. However, it was land, and as such more than welcome, however bleak it appeared from this side. We duly therefore carried on sailing, keeping a sharp lookout for signs of habitation, rocks, reefs, or any other hazards. Slowly we rounded the point and started along the other side. We went right round that damned island, and there was absolutely no place to land at all. The whole of the coast was just rock, with no bays or beaches at all. I will not dwell upon the disappointment of all of us. The crew were, if anything, more upset than I was. They were the most depressed-looking bunch I think I've ever seen. I took a photo of the island, and although I showed it to many people, no one could positively identify it. Various guesses were made, but no one was sure, and I don't know the name of it to this day, if indeed the wretched thing has one. I held a council of war, and ultimately all agreed with me that the only thing to do was to set off again on our old course, not knowing how far we should still have to go. I decided to conserve my fuel, and the awful business of towing under sail was resumed. As we were apparently approaching the islands, might in fact be amongst them for all we knew, it was imperative to keep a constant watch, in addition to the man at the helm. To be sure, there was a bit of grumbling at this, but all realized its necessity. To keep a 24-hour watch meant that each of us three had to do 8 hours out of the 24, and we arranged it for each man to do 4 hours at the helm, and then go forward for 4 hours lookout, and 4 hours in the bunk. During his lookout duties, he was expected to go up the mast at odd intervals. This imposed a great strain, as after 4 hours at the helm, which was infinitely tiring, to then go on watch was asking a lot, and indeed after the first day we altered it to 2-hour shifts at each job. We also swapped round the chaps on the tow, except Tutu and I, who remained aboard. I was snug in my bunk on the 3rd morning after leaving the island, when a cry of, "I see another island," sent me rushing up on deck. Arrived there, I suddenly remembered my dignity as captain, and returned to don a pair of pants. This time I came on deck at a more leisurely pace, and in an off-hand manner said, "Where away?" "Straight ahead," yelled Tutu, who was up the mast. I returned below to fetch the glasses, and ordering him down, went up myself. Sure enough, dead ahead was an island, a long way off to be sure, but much larger than the previous one. How he managed to see it without the glasses I don't know, as it looked a hell of way off still. I could not make out any details, even with the glasses, but there was no doubt that it was certainly much longer and higher. I find it difficult to judge distances at sea, because a very large island, a long way off, looks very similar to a smaller one much nearer. I studied the chart, but could not decide which it was. After all, there are 92 islands in the group, and if one includes atolls, the number is over 900. Some of the large islands are 400 miles from Mahi, the capital, and unless one knows which island one first encounters, whether one is struck the middle of a string of them or arrived at the northerly end of a group, it is impossible to guess which one it is until one has got one's position. This I could only do by landing and asking where I was and the name of the island. Once that was established, I felt fairly confident of reaching Mahi by dead reckoning, aided by calling in on other islands on the way. But to return to the island we were approaching, I decided to carry on under sail all that day, for I had no hopes of reaching it that day, and to adopt the same procedure as we did for the last one, that is, get reasonably near and stay outside until we could enter in full daylight, and then under power. All day we staggered along, but with a very cheerful crew this time. Great was the speculation as to what sort of pubs there would be, and dark plans were laid for the downfall of the local maidens. Arguments developed as to who should stand the first round, all claiming the privilege, and all knowing damn well it would be me. It was more than broadly hinted that another large feast was in order, and to this I did not object. After all, I had tons of provisions, and I could stock up again at Mahi. I did stipulate, however, that we should get much nearer before indulging ourselves, and that if we were still too far off to heave to for the night, the feast should be postponed. I did not fancy having all aboard at the same time, and risk drifting out of sight. True, I could have taken bearings, but did not trust myself to be accurate, and in any case, one more night would be no real hardship. I do not think I have mentioned the names of the other two. In fact, I did not see much of them, as Willie was absolutely against taking them off the tow too much, explaining that they had got used to it, and indeed there was quite a lot of truth in that. Their names were Francis and Philip, and they both looked very much alike. Both were thin, with narrowish shoulders, and a lot of noticeably missing teeth. Willie explained gravely that they had been named after saints. They had been partners of a sort for years, and both got roaring drunk on each other's saints' days. They were good fishermen, and one would never sail without the other. When I jokingly said it was evident that they were partners in crime, Willie shrugged and said, "What would you? Men must live." I did not inquire what crimes attracted their activities, but hoped one wasn't piracy. I should like to say here and now that serious crime is practically unknown in the islands, even in the capital, most being confined to the sort of Saturday night brawling one gets all over the world. Nobody ever seemed to shut up the houses at night, and I only know of one attempt at burglary, of which more later, all the time I was there, which, when you remember the poverty there is and how little they subsist on, is really pretty wonderful. Of course, the influence of Roman Catholicism is pretty strong there, and it may be due to this fact that I came across only one case of petty pilfering, and I suppose it happens occasionally. I should like to place on record that of all the months I was knocking about round the various islands, I never locked my bedroom doors. Hotel servants had the run of my room, both day and night, and I never lost a single article. But to get on with the voyage, as I suspected, we did not get nearly near enough to anchor down that day. But the next night I reckoned we were near enough to heave to and wait for the dawn. The wind, which until then had behaved so well, had let us down a bit, often almost dying away to nothing, and in addition the tow rope had broken again, and delayed us further. However, everything comes eventually, and here we were, pretty stationary, perhaps 10 to 15 miles out, hove to. I insisted that we took turns all night as watchmen, as I did not know if we might not slowly drift into a current and be swept on to the island. We got Francis and Philip aboard to share the watches, which gave us a good, and in my case anyway, a much-needed kip. The night passed uneventfully, and at dawn we found that we had again drifted, as last time, much closer to the islands. We were in fact about 5 miles off it. Still, none of them recognized which one it was. We could see the surf breaking on a reef, which cheered me no end, as where there is a reef, there is inevitably a break in it to sail through. The island was a mass of coconut trees, and the whole crew were at one in asserting that the island was somebody's coconut plantation, and that there were bound to be people ashore. It certainly had the look of being inhabited, although as yet we could see no houses. At about 6:30 a.m. we set off under power, approached as near the reef as I deemed wise, and then turned to starboard and started looking for signs of habitations and a break in the reef. I contemplated handing over the wheel to Willie, as he was much more competent at getting in and out of reefs than I was, having had years of experience, but in the end decided against it, as I thought he would be much more useful rushing about the deck, doing things in an emergency than I was. We were then, of course, on engine. We had hit the island in about the middle, and we sailed right up to the point without sighting anything but trees and reef. Tutu was at the masthead with the glasses, and we had done no more than round the point when he shouted out excitedly that he could see houses and people on the beach. I handed over the wheel to Willie and took over from Tutu. Francis and Philip were of course aboard the tow. Sure enough, at a point I judged to be about 5 miles along the coast, was a very small settlement, and I could distinctly see a few people on the shore. I found I was grinning all over my face. At long last, I was about to step ashore in the Seychelles Islands. I'd made it, despite the calms, the currents, the crack on the head, the lot. I'd made it. Incidentally, a priest later told me that all those misfortunes had no doubt been specially visited upon me by Providence, so that I should eventually be in the right position to rescue those 4 men. He may be right, I dunno. When I had been able to recover a stern countenance, I shinnied down and took the wheel again, sending Tutu to keep a good lookout for outcrops of coral, rocks, and other nightmares. We were still a good 2 miles out when we came opposite the settlement, and we could all see the break. It looked pretty narrow to me, but would no doubt be actually wider than it looked when we got nearer. I therefore turned to port, and tried to keep the entrance dead ahead. It could now be seen that the people on the shore were waving, and our lot were waving and shouting in return. I yelled at them to stop that, and to keep a good lookout all round. Meanwhile we had approached to within perhaps a quarter of a mile, and I didn't like the look of that break at all. Far from appearing a lot wider, it looked if anything narrower. There was quite a big swell breaking all round it, and on approaching still nearer, it was evident that there was a hell of a race coming out of it at knots. I needed time to consider what to do, how to risk it. The trouble was that the tow never kept dead astern, but would often swing in quite a wide arc, and I visualized us being halfway through and the tow crashing on to the side of the reef, or perhaps hitting head on before she even got inside. I therefore went about and started to head out again. Needless to say, this caused surprise, consternation in the crew, until I explained my dilemma. Tutu pooh-poohed my objections, saying that he would go aboard the tow, and he guaranteed to hold her steady whilst we were through. But I know no one could guarantee that. In fact, it was pretty long odds on that she would undoubtedly hit. I suggested that we anchored the tow outside, and that we alone should essay the break. After the usual amount of arguing and shoulder-shrugging, this was agreed to. Then I suddenly remembered that the tow's anchor had gone together with all her rope when she had gone adrift, and she was now anchorless. Although I had 2 anchors, I had no spare rope, most of it having gone into the tow rope. I could not leave the tow to drift about whilst we went in, and pick her up later. As sure as eggs are eggs, she would immediately drift ashore. For a good hour we tacked back and forth, seeking ways and means out of the impasse. Using the dinghy was suggested, but it was obvious that we certainly could not get the dinghy in with that race running. I dare say that Slocum or Captain Cook could have made it, but I was damned sure I couldn't. We could see the people on shore waving and dancing about, and no doubt they could not imagine what we were messing about for. Probably thought us mad, and so we were, with frustration, Suddenly, I hit on what must be the solution. This small village here must be the outcrop of what was doubtless a large metropolis on the other side of the island, and the main entrance would obviously be there. Heads were smacked, fists were punched. To think that we had been so dumb as not to have realized this. Now all agreed that it was obvious that no boat of our size could have got through that narrow gap, and with a tow to boot. Absolutely unthinkable. With high hope and new heart we set off again, to sail right round to the other side. The people ashore were now waving frantically, whether in a farewell or "I'll see you later" gesture, we could not tell. Once again the lookouts were on the job, scanning the coastline. After an hour we had spotted nothing, although there had naturally been a few false alarms. Birds spattered rocks looking like small houses in the distance, and so on. At about 3 o'clock, I suppose it must have been, we had met quite a big head wind, which slowed our always slow progress up considerably. We rounded the other point, and eventually came back to where we had started. There was not another entrance on that wretched island. I will leave my readers, if any, to imagine our thoughts and feelings. Each one reacted in his own way. Depression, rage, despair, frustration were all depicted on the countenances of the crew. Mine, I think, depicted the lot, especially rage. To be so near, and yet to be done by a ruddy stupid thing, like a narrow passage, was almost unbearable. There was nothing for it but to continue on the old course, and live in hope, if not exactly charity. Philip and Francis were all for having another shot on the morrow, but I pointed out that they had agreed with the rest of us that we could not possibly make it. In a really dispirited mood, we wearily set the sails, and shut off the engine, once again back to the old crawl. In an endeavor to cheer us all up, I handed out a generous tot of rum, floating the toes tot off to them, in a bottle attached to a string. Wearily we set about the old routine, one at the wheel, one looking out, and one in the bunk. I'm sorry to admit that I refused to make cocoa or prepare a meal for the others, but bunked down in a bit of a pet. I felt that the chap with the albatross had nothing on me. Mine was worse. I had a damned derelict toe which I couldn't get rid of. I seemed fated to tow it to eternity. Calms, typhoons, blizzards, anything would be preferable to this. The very sight of it made me sick, and I made up my mind to take the others aboard in the morning and cut the damned thing adrift. No one who has not experienced the terrible slowness of sailing with a tow can appreciate how frustrating it can be. With the engine it was not quite so bad, though bad enough in all conscience, but towing under sail was purgatory. We somehow managed to get through the night, and in the morning my natural cussedness reasserted itself. Mostly I think it was the thought of making that patron pay salvage that really influenced me, plus the fact that the men had said that they doubted if they would ever get another boat if they lost this one. Competition, it appeared, was keen with many other good fishermen, only too anxious to get a boat, and they, having lost one, no matter in what circumstances, would weigh pretty heavily against them. Then there was the matter of prestige. What was going to happen to all those headlines in the press if I jettisoned the damn thing? Gone would be my hero's welcome. I set my teeth and sailed on. We carried on all that day, and the next night as well, and when dawn broke there was another island in full view. It appeared to be about 15 miles away, a couple of points off the starboard bow. At once all was jubilation again, though not so exuberant as before. We cheered each other up by saying that third time was always lucky, and such indeed it proved to be. Down came the sails, and we forged ahead on the engine, one man up the mast, one in the bows, and myself at the helm. The island was bigger than the first one, and not so big as the second, and through the glasses we could see that it was pretty well covered in coconut trees. It was obviously a plantation, of which there are many on the islands. None of the men could recognize it, but guessed at various names. I did not worry about the name. My worry at the moment was whether there would be a nice, easy entrance, as we could see the surf breaking on the usual reef. This time our luck was definitely in. When we were about a mile or so off, we saw a small outboard boat coming out to meet us. A cheer went up from all hands. I suddenly remembered I ought to be flying all sorts of flags, asking for pilot, health authorities, port authorities, immigration chaps, and probably a few I've never heard of. But to hell with it. The main thing was to get safely anchored inside the reef, and they could start worrying about formalities afterwards. I couldn't have cared less. In no time at all they were within hailing distance, and questions and answers were flying between both boats, as they spoke in Seychelles, and all shouted at once. I could make nothing of it. Willie shouted to stop the engine, and before we had properly stopped, 4 of the men were aboard. There were handshakes, embraces, backslapping, except for me. I was still at the helm and being completely ignored, except for a few smiling glances and friendly nods. I decided it was time to come into the picture. "Hey," I shouted, "will one of you chaps pilot us in?" At once 2 of the islanders jumped down into the cockpit, and both grabbed the wheel. After the usual argument, nothing is ever done in the islands without a slight argument, one of them relinquished his hold and jumped back up. But I wasn't going to have any of that. I had come all this way against what you will admit were pretty heavy odds, and I was damned if I wouldn't finish the job and take her in myself. Hell, no heroic captain ever hands over his command. So I told them I would take her in, and if the outboard would go ahead slowly, I would follow her. Instructions were shouted to the chap in the boat to proceed, and I fell in line astern. We passed through a beautiful wide gap in the reef, into lovely smooth green water, and were then about half a mile from the shore. I was a bit worried about the depths, having no wish to run aground, but was assured that there was about 10 feet of water right up to about 20 yards off the shore. We went dead slow, and meantime the chaps were getting ready the anchor. I did not know if the tide was coming in or out, and not wishing to ground when and if the tide fell, I gave the order to anchor when we were about 50 yards offshore. It took and held at once, and having a vague memory of some tale about battleships, which I had read, I yelled out, "Finished with engines." the outboard came alongside, and the remaining crew of this came aboard, and there was more handshaking and congratulations. The tow, meanwhile, had drifted alongside also, and I wondered what to do, as she had no anchor. This was soon solved. It appeared that there was scarcely any tide there, and she could be beached, and tied up to one of the trees ashore. The outboard took the end of the tow rope, and she was soon hauled ashore by willing hands on the beach. She rested with a slight list to port, and I was later assured that she would be quite safe, as indeed subsequently turned out to be the case. All except me were now understandably anxious to go ashore, and the outboard made a couple of trips, and ferried what I now regarded as my crew to land. For a reason I cannot explain, I felt the need to sit and think a bit. Since picking up the tow, there had always been a lot to do, work and constant chatter, and suddenly I was reluctant to go ashore. I told them that I would come later, when I had done a few odd jobs. Left alone, I went below and lay in my bunk. Buller came up beside me, and it was not long before we both dozed off. Why I, who had been so anxious to get ashore for so long, should suddenly wish to stay aboard alone, I cannot explain, but there it was. This mood didn't last long. In about an hour I was ready, nay excited, at the thought of going ashore.